The farewell letter John Lennon wrote to Paul McCartney, but never sent. New York City, December 1980. The Dakota Building, that Gothic fortress on Central Park West, stood silent in the winter dark, its gargoyles watching the street below with their carved, impassive eyes. Inside, on the 5th floor, John Lennon sat at his desk in the early hours of the morning, a cup of tea cooling beside him, a sheet of paper before him. He picked up his pen, and he began to write to the one person he had never been able to say goodbye to properly. What if that letter, the one Paul McCartney never received, the one the world was never supposed to see, contained the most important truth John Lennon ever put into words? The year is 1980. John Lennon was, by every visible measure, a man who had found his way back to himself. The 5 years of domestic seclusion at the Dakota, years spent learning to bake bread, to be present for his son Sean, to exist in the world without the armoring apparatus of fame, had produced in him a quality of quiet that those who had known him in his most turbulent years found both surprising and deeply moving. He was calmer, more present, more willing to sit with a moment without immediately converting it into something else. Double Fantasy had been released that November, and its reception, mixed at first, then warming as critics and fans began to hear in it what John had intended. Not a retreat from relevance, but a declaration that ordinary life was the most radical subject an artist could choose, had given him a satisfaction that was different from the adrenaline of his earlier successes. It was quieter, more durable, the satisfaction of a man who has made something true. He was working on new music, planning a tour, the first in years, talking about the future with the casual confidence of someone who assumes, as all living people must assume in order to function, that tomorrow will come. He was 40 years old, and for the first time in longer than he could precisely remember, he felt like 40 was the beginning of something rather than the continuation of something that had already lasted too long. But in the small hours of December mornings, when the city outside his window finally quieted to something approaching stillness and Sean was asleep, and Yoko was asleep, and the apartment held the particular silence of a life that was genuinely, gratefully at rest, John would sometimes sit at his desk and find himself thinking about Paul. Not the Paul of the lawsuits, not the Paul of the competing press statements and the management battles and the decade of estrangement that had hardened, gradually, into something that neither of them had entirely chosen, but that neither had found the way to undo. He would think about the other Paul, the one who had existed before all of that. The boy from Allerton, Liverpool, whose melodic gift had taken John's breath away the first time he heard it, who had stood beside him on every stage and in every studio through the decade that had remade the world, who had been, and this was the word that John would find himself returning to in those quiet December hours, the word that neither pride nor stubbornness nor the accumulated grievances of a decade had managed to entirely extinguish: his brother. He picked up the pen, he placed it against the paper, and he began. Hey, before we continue with this incredible story, I need to give you an important warning. Many subscribers have reported that YouTube has removed their subscriptions without notice. Just take a quick look at the red button below to make sure you're still subscribed to the channel. I don't want you to miss any of the exclusive content that's coming up. And while you're there, leave that powerful like. That helps me a lot with the algorithm. Oh, and tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? I love getting to know every amazing person who is part of this community. Your participation makes all the difference. Let's interact. John Lennon at the desk. This is an image that those who knew him in his Dakota years returned to frequently, because it was one of the most characteristic images of that period. John, in the early hours, when the rest of the world was asleep, sitting at the antique desk in his study with a pen in his hand, and the particular, focused stillness of a man whose mind was fully engaged with something. He kept notebooks, dozens of them, accumulated over years, filled with his cramped, distinctive handwriting, song lyrics, fragments of poetry, observations, sketches, private reflections that he never intended for publication and that he protected with the fierce privacy of someone who understood the difference between the public self and the private one, and who had spent enough years having the private one exposed without consent to guard what remained of it carefully. The study was a warm, somewhat cluttered room, books on every surface, a piano against one wall, photographs arranged with the particular combination of deliberateness and apparent casualness that characterized the way John organized the spaces he inhabited. There were photographs of Sean, many of them, photographs of Yoko, and in a drawer of the desk, in a folder that John had marked with no label, a collection of photographs from earlier years, from Liverpool, from Hamburg, from the studio sessions at Abbey Road, from the tours that had taken them around the world in a blur of screaming crowds and shared hotel rooms, and the extraordinary, never-to-be-repeated intimacy of four people living inside the same impossible experience. Among those photographs, several featured Paul. Paul at 19, grinning at something John had just said. Paul in the studio, bent over a chord progression with the focused intensity that had always been his most characteristic creative posture. Paul on stage, in the full force of performance, his face lit with the particular joy that only live music produced in him. Paul as he had been before the end, before the lawyers and the competing visions and the accumulated weight of a decade of shared history finally exceeded what the relationship could bear. John looked at those photographs sometimes, in the small hours, in the quiet, and he would feel the particular, complex mixture of emotions that Paul had always produced in him: admiration and rivalry, tenderness and frustration, the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a friendship forged in the most extraordinary circumstances two young men from Liverpool had ever found themselves in, and the equally specific, irreplaceable pain of having let that friendship be damaged in ways that neither of them had entirely intended. He picked up the pen. He thought for a moment, and then he wrote the first line. Dear Paul. The letter did not begin with an apology. Those who knew John Lennon's writing style, his voice on the page, direct, unsparing, sometimes brutal in its honesty, but always grounded in a genuine attempt to say the true thing rather than the comfortable thing, would not have expected it to. John was not a man who began with apologies. He was a man who began with the thing itself, the raw material, the fact, and worked toward the understanding of it through the act of writing. He began, instead, with a memory. Dear Paul, I've been thinking about Hamburg. I don't know why Hamburg specifically. There are 10 years of memories to choose from, and most of them are more significant than a rundown club in the Reeperbahn, where we played 8-hour sets for audiences that were usually more interested in their drinks than in us. But Hamburg is where I keep ending up when I let my mind go where it wants to go. Maybe because it was before everything. Before the screaming and the suits and the press conferences and all the rest of it. Outside the window, the city moved through its particular, sleepless version of the small hours, the distant sound of traffic, the occasional siren, the vast, indifferent hum of a place that never entirely stopped. He thought about Paul. Not the abstraction of Paul that the estrangement had produced, the figure in press reports, the voice in interviews, the subject of legal documents, but the actual, specific person. The way he laughed. The particular gesture he made with his hands when he was explaining a melody he could hear but hadn't yet figured out how to play. The quality of his attention when he was genuinely listening, genuinely present in a conversation, an attention that, when it was directed at you, made you feel that what you were saying was the most interesting thing being said anywhere in the world at that moment. John had missed that. Had missed it more consistently and more quietly than he had ever admitted to anyone, including himself. He picked up the pen again. I've been trying to figure out when things changed between us. Not the official version, the management disputes, the Klein business, all of that. That's the version the lawyers understand. I mean when things actually changed. When we stopped being us and started being two people on opposite sides of something. I think it happened slowly. The way most real things happen. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of 1,000 small moments that each seemed, individually, survivable. A creative disagreement here. A slight there. The gradual hardening of positions that had once been fluid. And somewhere in that slow accumulation, we stopped talking the way we used to talk. Honestly, completely, without the buffer of management and legal representation and the performing of positions for the benefit of whoever was watching. I miss talking to you, Paul. I miss it more than I've let myself admit. The letter continued. John wrote in the way he always wrote when he was being most honest, without stopping to revise, without the second-guessing that produced the more carefully constructed version of himself that he showed the world. He wrote the way he had once made music in Hamburg, playing until sunrise because the playing itself was the thing, the process its own justification. He wrote about the creative rivalry, The years of unspoken competition that had driven some of the greatest music of the 20th century and had also, in its less examined dimensions, done damage that neither of them had been fully willing to acknowledge. I think I was jealous of you. There. I've written it. In all the years of interviews and songs and public statements, I've never said it that directly. But in the small hours of a December morning when there's no one to perform for, the truth is easier. Not jealous of your talent. I always knew my own worth, which was one of the problems, probably. Jealous of how easy it seemed for you. The melodies came to you the way water comes to water. You'd pick up a guitar and 20 minutes later, you'd have something that would take me a week of concentrated effort to approach. I told myself it didn't matter. That depth was more important than facility. And maybe that was even true. But it was also, I can see now, a way of managing something that I didn't want to look at too directly. And I think you were jealous of me too. Don't deny it, Paul. You're not reading this. I'm writing to you the way people write letters they never send, which means I can say the things that would make you defensive if you were actually here. You were jealous of the way people took me seriously in a way they didn't always take you. The serious Beatle. God, that label. It did both of us damage. It made me perform seriousness, and it made you perform charm, and neither of us was simply or entirely those things. We reduced each other. I think that's what I want to say. In the very act of knowing each other so well, we reduced each other to the versions of ourselves that were most useful to the dynamic we'd built. And when those reductions became the official versions, when the press started reporting them and the lawyers started working with them and the public started believing them, we couldn't find our way back to the fuller truth of what we actually were. John paused. He looked at the page. The handwriting had changed slightly as the letter progressed, looser, less controlled, the mark of a man who had stopped monitoring his own hand and was simply letting it move. He thought about the specific fights, the recorded ones, the ones that had made it into the documentary footage, the ones that had been analyzed and dissected and argued over for a decade. He thought about the unrecorded ones, the ones that had happened in hotel rooms and backstage corridors and the back seats of cars, away from the cameras, in the privacy of an intimacy that had once felt like the most solid thing in his life and had gradually, inexplicably, become the most contested. He wrote about one of those fights, a specific one from the final months of the band, whose details he had never shared publicly. Do you remember what you said to me the night before I told Alan Klein we were going with him? You came to the house, not Apple, not the studio, the actual house. Cynthia's house, which was already strange because by that point everything between me and Cynthia was already finished even if it wasn't yet official. You sat across the kitchen table from me and you said, I just want to know if we're still friends. Not bandmates. Friends. And I said something sharp back at you. I can't remember exactly what it was, and maybe that's mercy, but it was sharp, it deflected, it performed the contempt I had learned to wear as a defense mechanism. And you left. I've thought about that kitchen table conversation more times than I've ever admitted. What might have been different if I'd answered the actual question? If I'd said, yes, we're still friends. Whatever else is happening, yes. The answer would have been yes, Paul. In case you ever wondered. The letter reached its most difficult passage in the hour before dawn. John had been writing for 3 hours by then, the tea long cold, the city outside moving toward its gray December morning. He had covered pages, memories, confessions, the careful archaeology of a friendship that had been buried under a decade of estrangement, and that he was, in the privacy of this writing, methodically, tenderly excavating. And now he arrived at the thing, the central thing, the one that all the rest of the letter had been building toward without quite reaching, circling it the way his writing always circled the most important things before finally landing on them. He wrote slowly now, more carefully, the handwriting becoming more deliberate, more precise, as if the weight of what he was saying required a steadier hand. I want to tell you something that I have not been able to say in any of the songs or interviews or public statements of the past 10 years. Something that I think I've been protecting myself from saying, because saying it would require me to admit something about the past decade that is uncomfortable to admit. I have been lonely, Paul. Not in the ordinary way. Not in the way that anyone who is separated from their friends and their history is lonely. In a specific, particular way that is connected to you specifically. When the Beatles ended, when we ended, I told myself I was liberated. And in some ways I was. The creative liberation was real. Plastic Ono Band was the most honest music I'd ever made, and it could only have been made by a man who had just walked out of an institution that had, however brilliantly, been containing him. That's true. But there was another truth running alongside it that I didn't allow myself to examine. That the institution it had been containing me within was also the relationship I'd ever had with another human being that most closely approached. I'm going to write the word, Paul, because this is a letter that will never be sent, and the word is the true one, brotherhood. You are my brother, not in the blood sense. In the sense that matters more than blood. The sense of a person who knew you when you were still becoming yourself, who was present at the formation of everything you later became, who shared with you an experience so singular and so overwhelming that no one else on earth could fully understand it. Yoko knows me in ways that you don't and never could. That's not a comparison, it's a different thing entirely. But you know me in a way that Yoko doesn't and never could. You know the boy, the one from before. The one who stood on a Liverpool stage at 16 with a guitar that he barely knew how to play and felt, for the first time, like the size of him matched the size of the world. That boy needed you, Paul. I think the man still does. John set down the pen. He sat back in his chair. Outside the window, the first gray light of December morning was beginning to thin the darkness over Central Park, that daily, unremarkable miracle of dawn occurring with its usual indifference to the events of the night. He looked at what he had written. 6 pages of handwriting. 6 pages of the truest thing he had written in years, addressed to the one person who was not there to receive it. He thought about calling Paul. Had thought about it before, many times, in the years since the legal battles had finally resolved and the formal enmity had softened into something more ambiguous. Not reconciliation, not exactly, but the gradual, quiet loosening of positions that had once been held with the rigid certainty of people who need to be right more than they need to be honest. There had been phone calls. A few. Careful, slightly formal conversations that had carried within them the ghost of the conversations they had once had. The effortless, hours-long conversations of 2 people who never ran out of things to say to each other. The ghost was real. The warmth was real. But the distance was also real, and neither of them had yet found the specific form of courage required to close it entirely. John looked at the letter. He thought about Paul sleeping in his house in London, or Sussex, wherever he was now. The December morning arriving there 6 hours ahead of New York, Paul perhaps already awake, perhaps already at a piano, doing what Paul always did in the early morning, finding the melody that was waiting for the day. He thought about picking up the phone. John did not finish the letter that morning. He did not send it. He folded it, 6 pages of his cramped, honest handwriting, and placed it in the folder in the drawer of his desk, alongside the photographs and the other private documents that constituted the archive of his interior life. He went to bed as the December morning fully arrived. He slept. He woke in the mid-morning to Sean's voice in the corridor and the smell of the breakfast that the housekeeper was preparing in the kitchen. He came out of the bedroom into the warmth of the apartment and spent the morning with his son with the focused, unhurried attention that had become, in these Dakota years, his most cherished daily practice. In the afternoon, he and Yoko went to the record plant to work on the mix of Walking on Thin Ice. The session was good, productive, energized, full of the forward-moving, creative momentum of a man who is in the middle of something he believes in. He listened to the final take and said, "That's it. That's the one." He was happy. He came home in the early evening. He did not return to the letter. He did not think about finishing it that day, told himself he would come back to it. There was time. There was always time, in the ordinary, forward-moving logic of a life being actively lived, for the things that had been set aside temporarily. He would come back to it. He would finish it. Perhaps he would even send it. He never came back to it. What happened that night, in the darkness outside the Dakota building, on the pavement of Central Park West, belongs to history, to the permanent, devastating record of what human beings are capable of doing to each other. At 10:50 p.m. on December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot 4 times as he returned home. He was pronounced dead at Roosevelt Hospital at 11:07 p.m. The folder in the drawer of the desk was found by Yoko in the days that followed, as she moved through the apartment in the particular, devastated way of a person beginning the impossible process of understanding a loss that has no adequate framework. She opened the folder. She found the photographs. She found the letter. She read it in the chair by the window, In the December light that fell across the desk, where John had sat 3 nights before and written the truest thing he had written in years. She read it through once, carefully, and then sat for a long time looking at the last page, at the point where the writing stopped mid-sentence, the letter unfinished, the thought incomplete, the page still holding the white space of everything that had not yet been said. She did not send it to Paul immediately. She held it, privately, for weeks, processing it, understanding what it was and what it meant and what she owed to the person it was addressed to, and what she owed to the person who had written it, and how those two obligations could be honored simultaneously. When she finally reached Paul, in January 1981, in the white, stunned aftermath of a loss that the world was still trying to absorb, she read him portions of it over the phone. Not all of it. The most private passages she kept private, honoring John's interior life in the way she had always honored it. But enough. Enough for Paul to hear, in John's voice on those pages, the thing that the years of estrangement had obscured but never extinguished. Paul was silent for a long time after she finished reading. When he finally spoke, his voice was very quiet. When did he write this? Yoko told him. 3 nights before. Paul was silent again. Then, I wish he'd called. A pause. I wish I'd called. The letter that John Lennon wrote to Paul McCartney in the early hours of December 6, 1980 was never published in its entirety. Yoko Ono, who has been its custodian for over 4 decades, has shared portions of it in interviews and in the various biographical and documentary projects that have sought to tell John's story with the fullness and honesty it deserves. But the complete letter, all 6 pages of it, including the final unfinished sentence that trails off into the white space of a page that was waiting for a thought that never arrived, remains private. Perhaps it will always remain private. Perhaps that is right. There are things that belong to the people they were written for and to the people who wrote them, and that lose something essential in the transition to public consumption. The letter was not written for the world. It was written for Paul. And in the portions that have been shared, it has given the world enough to understand the nature of what was lost on December 8, 1980, and enough to understand that the loss was not only the music, not only the cultural force, not only the political voice and the artistic vision and all the songs that would now never be written. The loss was also this: a man who was, in the December quiet of his life, finding his way back to the most important friendship he had ever had, who was, page by page, in the privacy of his desk in the small hours, doing the work that the preceding decade had made impossible, the work of honesty, of vulnerability, of saying the true thing rather than the defended thing, who was, in 6 pages of cramped handwriting, building toward a phone call that he might, had time allowed, actually have made. Paul McCartney has spoken about John in the decades since that phone conversation with Yoko, with a consistency and a tenderness that has become, itself, a kind of testament. He has spoken about the unresolved things, the conversations that did not happen, the words that were not said in time. He has spoken about writing songs in the years after John's death that were addressed to him directly. Conversations continued in music because music was the language they had always shared, the one that predated all the legal documents and management disputes and competing narratives, the one that had been there at the beginning and that endured beyond everything else. In My Life, Paul has said, is the song that makes him think of John most consistently. A John song, not a Paul song, but one that Paul has always felt was, in some essential way, also about their friendship. There are places I remember, all my life, though some have changed. The places of Liverpool, of Hamburg, of Abbey Road, of a decade of shared stages and shared hotel rooms, and the extraordinary, never-to-be-repeated intimacy of 4 people living inside the same impossible experience. Some forever, not for better. Some have gone and some remain. John Lennon's desk is still at the Dakota. The apartment has been maintained with the particular, loving care of a place that holds the memory of a life. The chair where he sat, the window that looked out over Central Park, the drawer that held the folder, and in the white space at the bottom of the 6th page of an unfinished letter, in the space where a sentence began and did not end, where a thought was forming and did not complete, where a man was reaching across a decade of silence toward the person he had called his brother and was interrupted, permanently and without warning, by the most senseless of endings. The most important thing John Lennon ever wrote remains present, not in the words, in the space after them, in the white silence of a page that was waiting for more, that had more coming, that was part of a conversation that was going to continue until it didn't. The city breathes. Central Park holds its seasons. The Dakota stands, unchanged, its gargoyles watching the street with their carved, impassive eyes. And somewhere in the December quiet of the early morning hours, in the specific, unrepeatable silence of a man alone at his desk, pen in hand, tea cooling, the world asleep, the echo of that unfinished letter persists. What if the most important thing John Lennon ever wrote was not a song, not Imagine, not Working Class Hero, not In My Life, but 6 handwritten pages addressed to the one person he never found the words to say goodbye to, ending mid-sentence, in the white space of a December morning, with everything still to say and no more time left to say it.